In Greek myth, Thetis was a sea nymph, daughter of Nereus and mother of Achilles. The name of this aquatic deity has, appropriately enough, been a popular choice for ships of all kinds, including warships. Thetis has given her name to a number of vessels of the Royal Navy, 12 in fact, beginning with a store ship in 1717 and ending with the submarine Thetis, which tragically sank with heavy loss of life while on trials in 1939. She was raised and recommissioned under another name, and there has been no HMS Thetis since then. Today we're talking about the 8th HMS Thetis, a frigate launched in 1817. She was lost in a famous shipwreck on the coast of Brazil in 1830. But it is what came after she was wrecked that makes this HMS Thetis particularly historically significant, because she was a treasure ship, carrying a large and valuable cargo of bullion from South America to Britain. And in a remarkable salvage operation, almost all that treasure was recovered. HMS Thetis was one of 47 Leda-class frigates, built for the Royal Navy between 1805 and 1832. Thetis was constructed at Pembroke Dockyard in southwest Wales. Launched in 1817, she was completed in Plymouth, where she remained in reserve until commissioned in 1823. Built too late for the French wars, hers was to be a largely peacetime career. Thetis was about 1,000 tons burthen, 46 metres or 150 feet long at the gun deck, with a beam of 12 metres or 40 feet, and a draft of 4.5 metres or 15 feet. She carried 46 guns, a main broadside of 28 18-pounders, with 16 powerful but short-range 32-pounder carronades and 2 9-pounders. Her official complement was 315. Frigates were maids of all work in the navy of this era, and Thetis's career, while short, was varied. Under the command of her first captain, Sir John Phillimore, she conveyed diplomats to Mexico in October 1823, and remained in the Caribbean until the spring of 1824. She was then sent to West Africa to participate in the First Anglo-Ashanti War, serving as a troopship and taking part in various actions. In late 1824 and early 1825, Thetis was part of an experimental squadron in the Channel and Western approaches, assessing new vessel designs and carrying out exercises. Later in 1825, she carried dispatches between Britain and Portugal and patrolled in the Channel. In October, she conveyed the British ambassador to the Ottoman court from Portsmouth to Naples, arriving back in Portsmouth at the end of January 1826. In April 1826, she sailed to take Lord Ponsonby as ambassador to Buenos Aires, arriving at Rio de Janeiro at the beginning of August. Apparently, the ambassador and the captain did not get on. It seems Captain Phillimore had ordered Ponsonby off his quarterdeck for being improperly dressed, and Ponsonby took another ship for Buenos Aires, leaving the Thetis to return home, arriving in Portsmouth at the beginning of October. Thetis received a new commanding officer in November 1826, Captain Arthur Bat Bingham. She left Plymouth to join the Royal Navy's South American station in February 1827, sailing via Bermuda, where she dropped off a government mission on its way to Canada, and arriving at her new deployment in mid-August 1827. Thetis is shown during this period of her service in this painting. She is behind the flagship of the South American squadron, the two-decker HMS Ganges, with Rio de Janeiro in the background. At this period, the South American station covered both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts of South America. Thetis remained on the Atlantic coast until January 1830, when she rounded the Horn into the Pacific to patrol the coasts of Chile and Peru. Tragedy struck in August 1830 as she approached the end of her deployment, when Captain Bingham and Thetis's chaplain were drowned in an accident when a boat overturned. The first lieutenant took command and brought the ship back to the Atlantic, arriving in Rio de Janeiro in November 1830, where Captain Samuel Burgess was appointed to bring Thetis home. But she never reached home. 70 miles east of Rio de Janeiro stands Cape Frio, well known to generations of sailors coming in and out of Rio as a sea mark, its steep cliffs rising sheer from the waves. And on 5th December 1830, it was here that HMS Thetis came to grief. Robert Fitzroy, who became famous as captain of the Beagle during Darwin's voyages in the 1830s, and who had been a lieutenant in Thetis under Captain Phillimore, wrote of the loss of his former ship that, among the shipwrecks that have taken place during late years, perhaps none excited so much astonishment or caused so much trouble and discussion as the loss of that fine frigate, the Thetis. In this he was referring not just to the wreck itself, but to what came afterwards. The Thetis sailed from Rio de Janeiro on the morning of 4th December 1830. She carried about 300 people, and the treasure, a valuable cargo of gold and silver bars and coin. The intention was to take her southwards out of Rio and then turn to the east, once well clear of the shore, and run eastwards to a point safely beyond Cape Frio, before turning northwards in order to begin her passage up the Atlantic towards Britain. But things went very wrong from the start. Currents were difficult and winds were contrary, slowing their progress, while fogs and haze made observations impossible and forced them to navigate by dead reckoning. Not until around 4 in the afternoon of 5th December did the winds become slightly more favourable, and, thinking that they were well clear of land, Thetis's officers turned their ship towards the northeast. But they had mistaken their position. They were much closer to the shore, and had made much less progress eastwards than they realized, and at just after 8 in the evening, HMS Thetis ran straight into the cliffs of Cape Frio. This watercolour by Royal Navy officer Owen Stanley shows that first impact. Almost immediately, Thetis lost her bowsprit and masts, with many men being killed as they fell from the masts and rigging, or were struck by debris. For about an hour the dismasted hull drifted among the rocks and breakers beneath the cliffs, driven northwards along that harsh shoreline among a tumult of waves and smashing timbers, until forced by wind and waves into a small cove. Here her surviving crew were mostly able to make their way to the shore, but Thetis was steadily being torn apart, and at about 9:15 she sank on the eastern side of the cove, beneath cliffs rising to 200 feet in height, in water varying from 40 to 70 feet in depth. Between 20 and 30 men lost their lives in the Thetis. The Admiralty court-martial held on her loss admonished her officers for not making sufficient allowance for local currents and failing to take soundings, and Captain Burgess was punished with the loss of 1 year of seniority. Ships of war returning home from South America are generally freighted with treasure, noted the Nautical Magazine in 1832. As we have heard, HMS Thetis was indeed carrying treasure from South America to Britain, largely the product of British trade along the South American Pacific coast. Reports of the amount carried varied from around $800,000 to over $1 million, but the Times reported on 15th February 1831, as the first news of the sinking reached Britain, that the Thetis had specie on board on merchant's account to the amount of $870,000. Most of the specie on board of the Thetis was insured. This large sum has been obtained chiefly on the west coast of the Pacific, and may be referred to as a presumption that our commercial interests in that quarter are in a thriving condition. The dollars referred to are not US dollars, but Spanish dollars, pesos, the currency of the Spanish and former Spanish Empire, and the closest thing the early 19th century world had to a standard global currency. It was assumed at first that the treasure was all lost for good with the ship. An expensive loss, although, as the Times was careful to report, it was insured. But, despite the evident difficulties, the remoteness of the location, the depth of the wreck, the height of the cliffs that surrounded it, the violence and unpredictability of Cape Frio's weather and seas, the enormous wealth in the Thetis, was a strong incentive to salvage. It was a matter of having the will and finding a way. The person who had the will and found the way was Captain Thomas Dickinson of His Majesty's 18-gun sloop Lightning, which, at the time of the wreck, had, like the Thetis, recently arrived in Rio de Janeiro from a voyage along the Pacific coast of South America. He managed to persuade the Royal Navy commanding officer for South America, Rear Admiral Thomas Baker, to back him and provide resources and manpower for the salvage. The Admiral had already dispatched the brig sloop HMS Algerine to guard the wreck, recognizing its potential value. Dickinson, despite the prevailing pessimism over the possibility of salvage, was sure that it was possible, with the use of diving bells, which were a well-established, if somewhat risky, technology by the early 19th century. Captain Dickinson received his orders from Admiral Baker on 22nd January 1831. By this time, he was equipped with a diving bell, which he had designed and constructed himself, with its associated air pump. After locating the main part of the wreck and surveying the site, he decided to erect a fixed derrick, which would extend over the wreck from the shore of the cove. The derrick was constructed largely from spars which came from the wreck itself. This illustration comes from Dickinson's own account of the salvage operation, a narrative of the operations for the recovery of the public stores and treasure sunk in HMS Thetis, published in 1836. The derrick, which was over 50 metres or 160 feet long and weighed 40 tons, can be seen beneath the cliffs on the right-hand side, the focal point of a complex network of hawsers, cables, blocks, tackles and capstans that encompass the whole width of the cove. Boats are at work over the site of the wreck itself. Behind can be seen the zigzagging steps cut into the cliff face to give access to the shore, and some of the large numbers of people required to work on and support the salvage operation. Transporting this workforce to and from this remote and inaccessible location, housing and feeding them, and dealing with the inevitable cases of sickness and injury, all provided an additional set of problems for Dickinson and his colleagues to deal with. This further illustration from Dickinson's narrative shows a plan of the derrick in place on the shore of the cove. Here, marked in red, is the wooden derrick itself, its outer end projecting over a part of the cove labelled "Place where Thetis sunk." Setting up the derrick took a very long time, and while that work was underway, a launch was fitted with davits that enabled it to raise and lower a diving bell. Dickinson's first diving bell was soon joined by a second, and by mid-March 1831 men were descending regularly when conditions permitted, and raising timbers, bolts, ballast, shot, guns, and other fragments of the Thetis. This drawing, reproduced in the Nautical Magazine of March 1832, based on drawings made in November 1831, shows the scene on the bottom of the cove. It was not until 31st March 1831, however, that treasure was found for the first time, when the men working in the bell, as Dickinson describes it, came up with their caps full of dollars and some gold, and were greeted with hearty cheers, which reverberated from the surrounding cliffs. Through April and into May, gold and silver was raised from the wreck using the diving bells and the launch. The derrick, which had been under construction since February, was something of a disappointment. It was finally ready on 12th May, but only worked for a few days before it was wrecked by a gale. It was replaced with a suspension cable, which itself was not ready until late October, so the launch continued to be used to raise and lower the diving bells. In 1833, the marine painter John Christian Schecke painted 2 views of the salvage operation. The first, which was reproduced as the lithograph which we have already seen in Dickinson's narrative, shows the derrick in use during calm weather, along with the launch with its davits. The second shows the suspension cable in place, with the diving bell dangling perilously over tumultuous waves that fill the cove and lash ferociously at the cliffs. It is a sublime and romantic evocation of the power of nature, but also of human ingenuity. Treasure continued to come up from the wreck from May onwards, with the suspension cable being brought into use from late October. During the period from May 1831 to March 1832, Dickinson dispatched to Britain a total of $492,000 salvaged from the wreck. In March 1832, Dickinson, to his disappointment, was superseded at the salvage operation by Commander Frederick de Roos of the Algerine, after which another $161,500 were raised, amounting to over $750,000 of the $800,000 that were in the Thetis when she sank. Huge difficulties and challenges had been overcome to achieve this result, and it was not without cost. 3 men had died in accidents during the course of the salvage operation. Salvage work ended in August 1832, 1 year and 7 months after it had begun. The salvaging of the treasure from the Thetis was a remarkable achievement and excited great public interest. It was reported in detail in contemporary newspapers and journals. Papers on the work were presented to the Royal Society in London, and pictures were commissioned to record the event. The use of diving bells, the ingenuity shown in the systems of cables employed, and the impressive, if ultimately futile, erection of the derrick all attracted interest and admiration. Captain Thomas Dickinson's salvage work on the Thetis was widely praised, and he was honoured in 1832 with a gold medal from the Society of Arts. But he was bitter about the way he had been treated. He felt that credit for his achievements was being taken by others, particularly Commander de Roos, who claimed credit for the cable system used in the final stages of the salvage, and Admiral Baker, who asserted that the diving bell used, which Dickinson said he had invented, was in reality his invention. Dickinson engaged in prolonged public disputes over the matter. The publication of his narrative of the salvage operation in 1836 was an effort to set the record straight, as he saw it. His treatment following the salvage was even discussed in Parliament. Dickinson also felt literally short-changed by the Admiralty. The treasure raised from the Thetis had a value of £163,000 sterling. The accepted salvor's share of that would be 1/3, or around £54,300. The Admiralty, however, decided that, after deductions for Royal Navy expenses, the salvor's share would be a mere £17,000, and it was even argued at one point that, given that Dickinson and de Roos were both serving naval officers acting under orders, they were not entitled to any share of the salvage at all. A share was also claimed by Admiral Baker as Commander-in-Chief, which Dickinson felt was unjust, particularly as Baker had been dismissive about Dickinson's contribution to the operation. He'd even been rude about Dickinson's derrick, describing it as enormous, unwieldy, and absurd. By this stage, Dickinson seems to have been rather unpopular with his fellow officers, except for those who had served with him in the Lightning, who stood to benefit from his share of the salvage, and on whose behalf, as well as his own, he was fighting. He could clearly be a difficult man, but he was proud of what he had achieved, and felt strongly that without him the salvage would never have happened, and he was almost certainly right about that. Dickinson challenged the Admiralty in court and in the Privy Council, and the share due to him and to the Lightning was eventually and reluctantly increased by £12,000. He saw no further service at sea, and was never promoted beyond post-captain. He was still engaged in angry disputes about the raising of the treasure of HMS Thetis at his death in 1855.